podcast too. Hello, hello. Welcome back. Today we will talk about breakups, something always very interesting. I'd like to ask you, in your years of experience working with your clients and even also in your personal environment, what's the biggest difference that you see between women and men, the processing and everything around it?
Great question. The thing that stands out the most, without a doubt, is the difference in support systems. So women have an innate ability to connect with the nurture and the qualities of support that are around them and that are there for access. A lot of men, and not by fault of their own, not only have not really sat with the ability to connect with the discomfort, but they also don't have the right support systems around them to hold them within that space. See, one of the most powerful things I witnessed in my life was the ability for the feminine to congregate and hold space for one another. Straight away there's a natural purge, there's a cleanse, there's an opportunity to be held and to really feel what it's like to be a part of a collective and a community and ultimately come as you are. I mean, what happens within those councils seems very private within that women's space, and I very much respect that. Obviously, I know firsthand what it's like to be a male and what that looks like on the other side. And the thing is that particularly when it comes to men, if we look at life as a teaching, there hasn't been many positive examples for men that have been set in terms of standard of emotional expression, articulation, and ultimately releasing. And so what happens is, as I mentioned, not by fault of anybody's, but when you haven't practiced something, how are you meant to get good at it? And so the reality is, when a man experiences a breakup, if they're very, very fortunate, they'll have some kind of support system. But a lot of the time, there's no tools of navigation. There's no external support, meaning that people know how to hold that space. And there's a lot of just suppression and pretending that you are okay or better than what you actually are. And so when I've experienced that firsthand, I've noticed the disconnection that happens with self. Because if I try and share my feelings about a very challenging situation to somebody who is unavailable, it's very quickly shut down. And it's not because that person doesn't want to hold that space. It's just they don't know how to hold that space. And what I mean by that is we can only support somebody within the capacity we can support ourselves. Meaning that if you have gone to those deeper places within, then you can naturally hold that space. And so in that moment, if somebody feels uncomfortable around not being able to hold that space, not being able to give advice or know what to do, or simply just not feeling comfortable because this person's pain is triggering their pain, then it's very quickly shut down. And so a man is left wondering and also not feeling comfortable or safe enough to even truly express themselves. Hence the process of suppression and avoidance. But we look at it on the other hand with women and the way that the feminine naturally wrap around one another. I would say that it's almost instantaneous. If there is a breakup, for example, that has happened, then instantly friends are dropping what they do to get behind that person and be with that person however they can. And even if it's not possible to be in physical support, it is absolutely supported morally and it's supported in the best way that they know how. And also too, I'm sure you know this better than what I do, is it's ongoing support. It's not just seasonal. It's not just in the moment. It's there, it's consistent, and it's checking in, and it's understanding how that person is day to day, seeing their strengths, holding their challenges, and ultimately letting them know on all levels that they are supported. See, it's not like that for men. The majority of men have never experienced anything like that. And so when it comes to men's mental health, if you have never been shown how to do something, how are you expected to know what to do? And so it is a very confusing and already a very uncomfortable time for a human being to try and process and understand those emotions. And of course, most people are going to try and use the external as an example, but it is obviously the internal narrative that is showing and sharing more about where you are truly at. And so what I've always noticed and seen is when two people have come together and for whatever reasons they choose to go apart, you then as an individual have a choice. The choice is whether you choose to sit with self, learn the lessons and the teachings that were there to be learned, understand the points of where one can take accountability to enable growth, and ultimately see what they want to do different. By doing all that, you are naturally raising your frequency. You are evolving up. You are taking time for yourself. You are connecting to what needs to be nurtured, that self-care element, which women do so well. It's also a forgiveness. It's a letting go. And it's a gentle understanding that compassion is what is need to be shown to be able to support that growth. So ultimately, you are going to evolve emotionally. You're going to rise up and you're going to go and into different areas and different points of connection where ultimately you will meet another person who has also done that point of evolution, that upgrade in frequency. And then you will meet that person because we can only meet somebody on the level in which we're at, meaning we can own the beauty that you see in somebody else is the beauty that you hold within. And same with the growing edges or the negatives. And so the other choice is if you avoid, if you suppress, if you actually do everything you can to pretend that you're okay, to avoid actually sitting with the discomfort, because that's what it is. It is very uncomfortable. But that is what most people who avoid doing any kind of developmental work is that's what they're doing, is they're avoiding sitting with the discomfort. Mostly out of fear that they're going to relive an experience, but mainly also because when you don't have the tools to be able to self-soothe or self-nurture, it is even more uncomfortable. So this happens over time. Periodically, somebody's frequency and energy will go down. You will then also do the same. You will attract somebody who's on that frequency. And that's why some people have to learn the lesson over and over and over. Because it's not necessarily about the teaching within that connection or relationship. It's the lessons you learn when you are by yourself. It's what you embody. It's what you actually then self-actualize and then what you take and turn into mastery. And that ties into self-worth. It ties into your boundaries that are set. It ties into your belief systems and why things are actually showing up the way that they are. So these are the options. But these choices are made more often than not depending on the support systems that a person has around them. Because if, for example, all your closest, nearest and dearest get behind you and say, you can do anything, we've got your back, you know, it's all going to work out, then you're going to embody that. You're going to believe that. But when your support systems are, she'll be right, get over it, and there's also a lot of negative talk about a person, then that is the stuff that keeps you stuck. That is it. And it's very evident after a relationship hasn't worked out who is actually going to evolve quicker and which direction they're going to evolve. Because at the end of the day, if you take accountability, you're not actually pointing the finger at anybody. You're not casting blame. You're not pointing out all the reasons why it didn't work. You're sitting with the discomforts that came up within that relationship. What was the insecurities / pain that I was experiencing that I was bringing to this relationship? What was I projecting? What was I suppressing? What was I confused about? What was I confident about? You know, these self-reflective questions are going to give you the answers to your greatest lessons. But a lot of people feel that it's external, feel that everything is outside of themselves. And it's hard to see, as we love this saying on the show, you can't read the label from inside the jar. And it's very natural. But once again, if you haven't been shown or you haven't been guided or you've never even been held, then you're going to continue to repeat the same patterns over and over and over and ultimately create the same choices. So if something's worked in the past, then you're most likely going to do it again. But then the frustration comes because you're not getting a different result. And this is what brings a lot of people to that turning point. It's not that their life is out of control. It's not that there's chaos. There might be a little bit, but it's not completely chaotic. But it's the frustration. It's the desperation of being like, I'm trying things, I'm doing these things, and I'm not getting a different result. How do I get a different result? And that can bring up some of the most discomfort because it's evident that you are not on the right path that serves you. And so by unpacking in the way of just recognizing, of just taking a broader look of how things are actually showing up, right? It's like when you've got a jigsaw puzzle on the table and you're so focused on it and you're trying to find that piece. Sometimes it's better just standing up and walking away, going to grab a drink of water, coming back. And then you say, oh, there it is. So it's about perspective. It's about what perspective do I have now? And also to what perspective can't or haven't I seen yet? And that's that curiosity. That's that opening up. And then the thing is, when you open yourself up to receive, it's also to when a lot of change and growth can happen. And that is where you actually see experiences for what they are. And you're able to clean them out, the wound that was, and it actually healed properly. You'll be able to move on with your life. See, it's when we just find so much discomfort in something that the wound is fresh and you just want to close it up and just move on. But it doesn't heal properly. And so, like, people have this misconception around therapy that, oh, it's all about the past. It's all about the past. The past just shows you what's showing up in the present. That's it. Because we've come from somewhere. Absolutely, there is no point being stuck in the past because that cannot be changed. But understanding how that past is showing up now will ultimately change your future. Because that is awareness. All we have is what we have right here, right now, this exact moment. But the future, if we're lucky, is coming. So it's just awareness. It's just growth. It's just reflection. It's curiosity. It's compassion. It's being gentle to yourself. It's learning to build a positive relationship with yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are the person who is with yourself forever. So that is what a lot of this work is. It is relationship building. It's relationship building with self. And as I said, that relationship gets built far quicker and stronger when you have the right support systems around you. And that is why there is imbalance in the world at the moment, is because the masculine, there's a lot of pressure on the masculine for the things that they're not doing. But the thing is, it's about what has never been taught. And if you think about it on a global scale and a generational scale, that the parents of today, the millennials of today, are rewriting the pages. So that means that Gen Alpha is the first generation in history who is getting parented differently as a collective. Not tough love, gentle support, curiosity. So you think about that on a big scale, that's remarkable. And so a lot of the millennial generation are doing the work for the next generation, breaking those cycles, doing something different, showing up, putting a foot down, saying, this is not right, something's not right, this doesn't work. And so you think about all the generations before that and how many millions of people got parented the same way. So things take time. And support is the most valuable thing a person can have in their life, whether they know that or not. And if you can support yourself and hold yourself, then you are already miles ahead. And this is what is the work is learning to support. Because once you know how to support yourself, then it naturally has a ripple effect on the people around you. Because you can be accountable in a loving way. You can do an inventory on what's working, what isn't. But most importantly, you can be kind, compassionate, caring to yourself. Put yourself first. As I said before, like, women are incredible at self-care. You know, in my personal experience, that's what I observed. I just watched. I was like, all right, well, I've had breakups in my life. I've tried things. It certainly didn't work. But it seems that women always bounce back. Like, what's the difference? So I just watched. You know, I'd go run a bath. I'm like, I'm going to have a bath tonight. And it's just because it's like, I want to try new things. And I want to, you know, if I want to get a tub of ice cream, I'm going to get a tub of ice cream. You know, like, I want to look after myself, but I also want to be kind to myself. I'm not going to beat myself up that I did this. And I'm not going to do the normal, making the same choices. I'm going to do something different. But it all comes from care. And then that care also means putting your hand up and saying, hey, I'm actually not doing that well. But also being selective with who I share that with. Because I remember one time when I was working in a friend's barbershop, there was a barber next to me and he was cutting hair, and I could overhear the conversation. I could hear that the guy in the chair was trying to open up and trying to share. And the barber didn't really know how to take that, didn't really know what to do. And I could hear that he was kind of brushing it off and trying to change the subject in bits and pieces. And so anyway, later that day, we had a moment together out the back, and I shared with him. I said, just want to bring to your attention what had happened earlier. And I said that this is not your fault, or there's nothing wrong with what you did, but just be aware that if somebody is trying to open up and express themselves, particularly a man in a barbershop, a very sacred space, if they feel shut down, they may never open up again. And so we need to honor that. And it's not about you having to have the answers, but just acknowledge that you hear them. Let them know that you hear what they are saying. And maybe offer a little bit of kindness, support, a reassurance. You're going to be okay. But I hear you. We're here for you. If you need any help, we're here. Just let them know that they have support. Let them know that we are together and it's going to be okay. And that was always very prevalent for me. Just see that, just to hold it, you know, just a hand on the shoulder, just like, you got this. You know? And that is what I've learned over the years is the most crucial part, is the support systems. But be selective as a man. And that's why going to a professional is so valuable, because at the end of the day, what a professional does is they hold space for you to look within. And what a lot of men in particular don't realize is they're actually practicing emotional articulation in that space. That is your, that is your gym. That is your vocal gym, your emotional gym. You're going in there, you're doing the reps, you're talking about how things feel. Okay, well, let's describe that. Let's sit with that. You're practicing. That's what it is. A therapeutic space is about safety. It's about practice. So then it means that once you have practiced something, you are more confident in actioning it. So then that translates into your relationships. That translates into your parenting. That translates into your workspace. So the ripple effect is there. So it's all about support. but also being selective with who you choose.
You were talking about capacity a lot, right? So the capacity of your environment to hold you, but as well as your own capacity to reach out, I would say. And as you said, you need practice to do that. But for someone that doesn't even know where to start, or there's maybe a lot of pride that holds them back, what would your advice be? Like where to start, or, what's the best thing to do?
It's a beautiful question. Where to start can be honestly one of the most overwhelming thoughts and steps on the path. Because when one has never stepped onto a path and going into the unknown, it's hard to even fathom what that looks like or ultimately what it feels like. So it's about starting from a place of curiosity, no expectations, recognizing from within yourself that something isn't right and that this feeling is not aligned. And then knowing that nothing is permanent. I often say to people, and that's why when I have calls with clients before working with each other, we have to see whether this is a good fit. We have to see whether we both want to choose to work with one another. So it's about trial and error. It's about saying, well, I'm just going to invite curiosity into this. And what have I got to lose? Because a lot of people don't take that first step because of how they think they're going to be perceived by others, perceived as weak, perceived as unstable, perceived like they've got a problem. And when one realizes that their actions are being decided on somebody else's thoughts or expectations or perceptions of them, then you realize that it's not even the truth of who you are. You're not actually moving forward with what you want. Because the thing is, it does take a lot of bravery. And it takes a lot of work joining the dots because everything is connected. And what I mean by that is that there's no one solution. And when people understand that, then they are naturally going to invite more curiosity into their journey. Because I look at all the modalities like a wheel, and like the spokes of the wheel, at the end of every spoke there's a different modality. And all of those modalities are what creates the turning of the wheel. It's not just, there's people now who talk a lot about their plant medicine ceremonies. They talk about their connections with their personal practices, their Reiki, their therapy sessions, all of these things. All of those modalities, all of those tools are tools to connect you with you, to a deeper part of you. And so once you connect to yourself on those deeper levels, then you raise awareness. And then your awareness naturally changes. You become more aware of what you need, your emotional instabilities, what you actually believe about yourself, and how all of these things start to play out within the choices that you make. And so I say to people, it's like when you are even curious enough to know that something isn't right, just talk to somebody who's done something. Hey, what was that like for you? Oh, yeah, I might give that a go. Get a reference, get a referral from somebody. Go, okay, well, yeah, nothing to lose. I'll just give it a shot, see what happens. Use the examples you have around you. And if you don't have direct examples, go online, watch videos like this, like check it out, just see what's happening, see how it feels. Go, okay, I resonate with that guy. Yeah, I'll reach out, see what he says. I mean, we jump on a 20-minute call, see how it feels. You know, like there's no obligations. You don't owe anybody anything, but you just got to connect with yourself and know that if something doesn't feel right, then it's not. And just take that first step. Be kind, be gentle. You know, I have seen marvelous results in shorter amount of times, because when people show up and they're ready and it all lines up, then you want to absorb the teachings from within. You want to connect to those teachings. But if you're not ready, then you're not ready, and that's okay. So it's about really listening, but using the outside world as a referral of people you know, people who have experienced something different, and then being open to try.
Within your personal experience, would you say that your environment, your support system has also changed over the years, in the sense of kind of adapted or changed because you have changed and you were more open and able to reach out and even kind of surround yourself with the right people? Have you seen like a big difference?
Definitely,
Yeah. Mm.
absolutely. I think the most noticeable difference for me was the support systems within myself.
Mm.
You know, like removing alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge one, because now I had far more grounding, far more clarity, and I wasn't swayed emotionally. You know, so I learned that what I was feeling was what I was feeling. So then I got to sit with that. I got to understand that more. It wasn't just like, oh, that feels awkward, so now I'm going to go avoid or detach or disconnect from that.
Mm.
So, which can be a little bit confronting at the beginning, right? Because you're like, it's almost like these whole new experiences, but it was the experiences I was having before, but I was just choosing a different path to connect or disconnect from them.
Mm.
And then I ultimately realized what the connections with my friends were and what, like, why they were. So within the early days, I realized that it wasn't fair for me to go to my group of friends who like deep philosophical chats and expect to want to party. And I couldn't go to my friends who prefer to party and expect deep philosophical chats. So once I kind of understood the connections of why I had friends and groups in the first place, then it meant that I could really show up. It meant that if I wanted to socialize, I knew which group to go to. But I used to check in and be like, do I actually feel like socializing? Do I feel like going to that party? Do I feel like going to this event? And then I'd be like, no, I'm pretty content with where I'm at and I'm pretty happy. I think I'm going to get more value out of going to see friends who do the complete opposite. You know, so it's like the support system changed because I recognize what support actually is. And I wasn't projecting my expectations onto anybody else. And that took a little while to kind of dial in. But ultimately, regardless of how many groups or what group I went and saw, I was still always with myself. So I had to understand the narrative that was happening in my head. Where is that coming from and what's it saying? Why is it saying that? And how is that affecting me? So this took a little while to kind of unpack. And if I look at my bigger picture of my journey, it was probably the slower part, because it took me a while to really understand how important that self-love and self-care and compassion really is. But I really brought it back to myself, and I was like, okay, well, how do I develop this relationship? And when you're already taking the steps in the right direction, meaning you're making like positive changes, then one becomes more available to receive that knowledge and wisdom. Because as I said, you're not clouded by certain things. And I've always promoted that, you know, when it comes to things like alcohol, like it just comes down to your relationship with it. And so when I realized that, from the moment I stopped drinking, I always stood by the words of that. I believe, honestly, that there is alcohol that is not a problem. Drugs are not a problem. What the problem is your relationship with them. So you could have a very, very healthy relationship with alcohol, and mine might not be the case. But that's for me to figure out, and that's for me to be honest about. And so when you actually start doing that inventory and you start becoming really honest with your relationships in your life, then the ripple effect is quite profound, because then you start to see why you actually are in certain relationships. And am I dependent in this relationship? Am I creating dependency? Am I anxious in this relationship? Am I avoidant? Like, how am I showing up? What am I doing? What am I not doing? What am I leaning into? What am I running away from? What pattern has come before that is still seems to be quite prevalent, you know? And it's not that everybody has to do a huge amount of introspection, but I think fundamentally what is the best course of action is just that initial honesty around whether or not something feels right, you know, and really asking into that. You know, I think we're in a very, very special time that we have so many resources, we have so much information, we have people who have led the way. There's groups, there's workshops, there's retreats, there's, you know, it's just, I mean, it's even to the point where there's sometimes too much. And a lot of it is kind of like a joke, to be honest, but it's incredible what's at hand. You know, you could just devour podcasts on a particular topic. You know, you can go to all kinds of different gatherings. And so we're very, very lucky, luckiest we've ever been in that regard. But as I said, it still takes that authenticity, that truth of being like, and that ties into your worthiness, right? When you know that you're worthy of something better, different, more aligned, more truthful, more respectful. Because, you know, you and I have discussed it before, where it's like, you know, when you're in that relationship and it's like, we're bringing out the worst in each other. You know, being honest about that. And it's nobody's fault, but it's just like, that's what the teaching is. You know, you're mirroring these wounds that are still unhealed. And it's like, it's a shame, because you're like, oh, okay, well, thank you so much for the teachings, but I guess this is what the connection was for. And that's, once again, after the fact, is like what you choose to do with that knowledge and information and insight. And, you know, I see it sometimes in clients, and some people see that like they've been trying to learn the same lesson. They pin it back to how this pattern has been showing up. And they go, wow, I was doing that even in 2 relationships ago. You know, so then when you come to this self-actualizing and understanding of being like, well, that's me doing it. And it's very natural, right? If we don't know what we don't know. So when you know, you can make different choices, which ultimately leads to different outcomes. So it's an amazing journey. It really is. It is absolutely life-changing in the best ways, because you become more aligned with the actual experience. You know, you actually, I mean, that is the gift of human beings, right? The fact that we can feel and experience things on multiple different levels, and the depth of that emotional like understanding. And so when you tap into that, it's powerful, it's beautiful. And you see the balances and imbalances within your life, the balances or imbalances within your masculine and feminine, how when you create that equanimity, how you can choose to lean into one or the other, because you know that it is harmonized. It's not one overpowering the next. It's not one being in a role to protect and defend. It's like you create balance within yourself.
And trust.
You trust. You become more reliable. You become more, trusting. You become more grounded, clearer, gentler, stronger in the right areas. I've seen men become amazing fathers. Amazing fathers. Not because they got more manly, but because they learned to be more vulnerable. And they learned to hold space for their children. And that is so beautiful to see. Because, the tough love days only get you so far, right? And so it's one of those journeys in life that will never be regretted. But it is the first step can be the hardest.
I'd like to ask into something that you said in the very beginning when you were saying nowadays, unfortunately, the focus is on what men are not doing. What do you mean by that? Or do you have a specific example maybe from your clients, from your environment?
Yeah, definitely. Once again, like tapping into that vulnerability. It's not, and for a lot of men, like even hearing that word is uncomfortable because there's an automatic association with weakness. And that by talking about your feelings, that you're, particularly in Australian culture, is that you are basically whinging. You're complaining about something. And so the actual title or definition of vulnerability is not really orchestrated to the depth of its capacity. And a lot of what people do is they focus more on what they're doing and not on what they're not doing. Because as we know, actions speak louder than words. So it's like, Einstein's theory is like you're doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So you see a lot of nowadays, there's, far more men's groups and circles and bits and pieces. But being more manly isn't about eating more steak and, talking about finances and talking about all of these things in terms of provisions and providing for people. It's actually about leaning into the parts of yourself that haven't been nurtured or accessed. Because once again, you can only hold that space for somebody else if you've actually connected to that part of yourself. So the gentleness, the holding space while somebody cries and being there for them, actually the willingness to just listen, to not make it about you, to not have to defend yourself, to not bring the ego in, all of these things. It's like what we talk about guards and putting up the walls. And walls absolutely keep things out, but we have to remember that they keep things in too. And when one starts to break down the walls of this armor or this defense, the vulnerability lies in people thinking it's going to let things in, but what it does is it lets things out. And then once you let things out, you realize you're no longer carrying that around with you. And this is the paradox around mental health and the work itself, is that by being stoic and not doing the work or not talking about my feelings or not being vulnerable or not seeing a therapist and not doing that, there's this pride, there's this bravado, this is like I'm getting on with life, I'm just doing it. That's for other people, not for me. But the reality is you're carrying your baggage with you everywhere you go. You're carrying that weight unnecessarily. So it's almost like you are literally going down with your own ship when there was no need to do that at all. And I often talk about pressure. And the way that it works is if you look at anything mechanical that builds up pressure, it has to have a release valve. Otherwise it explodes. Humans are no different when it comes to their emotions. If you think of yourself as an emotional vessel that over time just builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up, guess what? Same thing. It either implodes and men completely shut down, or it explodes. And so that in itself is unsustainable. And you don't have to go that far. You don't have to get to that point. You don't have to lose it all for it to explode in a way of that capacity. And just like any kind of machine, it's about releasing pressure at the right time so it doesn't build up. So the system, so the whole thing can work more efficiently. And that's what learning to express actually does. And that's what a lot of people aren't doing, is actually just being human and expressing themselves and learning to connect to those parts of themselves and just being honest. You know, like some people are so afraid of their own anger. But there's nothing wrong with anger. It's only whether you attach to it and stay in that state. And then when you recognize why you're angry, and it's ultimately a lot of times from something that is outside of your control or something that you feel vulnerable because you do not control, then it's like you can sit with the emotions that are tied to that and not have to be angry and lash out, particularly in a physical way. So it's like, but being angry and having that discomfort is a very human experience. But over time, you learn that that feeling is attached or created from something completely different. And so, once again, focusing on what you're not doing is going to shine more of a light on focusing on what you are doing. Because if what you are doing has been repeated and it's not getting the results you want, then something needs to change. So that's why in this modern day and age, the greatest tool you can have, particularly for a man, is access to your emotional state and having the ability to do it in not only fluidity, but also in times of need, in times of those communications with your partner, in times of frustration, in times of fatigue, in times of restlessness, stress, grief. All of these are just life experiences. And when you can access that in that moment and you can apply the ability to be able to self-soothe, calm, and regulate, then guess what? You are a better partner. You are a better father. You are a better employer, employee, because you are sovereign of your emotions. You're regulating yourself. You're taking accountability for the emotions that have been experienced. You're able to sit with them and you're able to regulate them. So you become safer. You become more approachable, kinder, more gentle. And this is not a weakness. This is, in fact, one of your greatest strengths. And when it's reframed and it's experienced, then one truly knows that. Because life just gets better. It actually gets more enjoyable. So you don't have to go down with the ship. It's not necessary, particularly nowadays.
You mentioned self-soothing. I think that's something that's, I would say I've heard a lot as well, and maybe our listeners too. And it sounds very beautiful and like a beautiful practice to have. So do you have any self-soothing exercises that you could recommend, or something that you also share with your clients that you might want to share?
Definitely. A really good example of it is, first off, just witness what your thoughts are trying to tell you in a way of just, was that a positive thought? Was it a negative thought? Was it neutral? Was it unnecessary? Was it overthinking? What was it? Just bring awareness into how your everyday mind operates. Then if you notice that some thoughts are much more negative than others, then write that down. And don't put any attachment to it of needing to change it in that moment or anything, just simply write it down. Over time, give yourself a week, see what words have been written. Then you get a better understanding of where A, that might come from, or B, how often this is coming in. Then on the other side of that, write the complete opposite or something positive that counteracts that. Because what happens with the mind and pattern behavior is that it is literally hardwired. So from our past, something has happened, an action has then been reflected, and that has then created an imprint on the brain of what to do in the future. This is how you solve this problem. And so if it comes through negative self-talk or negative disbelief and all of these unnecessary behaviors, then that's what gets locked in. So when you combat a negative with a positive and you choose to focus on the positive as opposed to the negative, you are naturally rewiring the brain. And so this is what happens over time. So the work that I do with a lot of people is about practice, but it's like practicing the right thing. Because in life, you can't get good at anything unless you practice. But once you know the formula, then you're on the right step, and it happens quicker than you think. And so when you witness the negative thought and you now know the positive counter to that, then you tell yourself that. You are now challenging your old belief system or your old thought pattern. Within that, you can witness whether there was any discomfort, whether there was any shame or any guilt attached to that. And then ultimately over time, you are just rewiring. So now a lot of clients actually do it in their phone, and they'll have this list. And so say a negative thought comes up and they're quite overwhelmed. They pull out their phone and they go, oh, and then they just say the positive. Or they just run through the list of positives. And 9 times out of 10, before you even get to the bottom of the list, you've actually regulated yourself. You know? And so this practice fundamentally is vital because you are going in for the answers. You are relying on yourself. You're not going, oh, I feel horrible, I'm overwhelmed, give me a drink, I'm going to lash out at that person, oh, just get me out of here, avoid or suppress, things like that. You're actually going, no, let me get in control of this, go within, yep, say what I need to say, okay, cool. And for anybody who has never done anything like this, it might seem very basic and it might seem very unfamiliar. But it is what compounds over time, because that's just the beginning. Because once you raise awareness of what is actually happening, you realize that this has been probably most likely been happening for a very, very long time. So if you are now aware of this now, not only what change can you make, but also what was completely unnecessary. So it's really about learning the techniques and the tools to connect. And a lot of the work that I do is also about, with art therapy, using processes to connect to the subconscious, going much deeper to notice why things have shown up the way they have, where it actually ties back to, and ultimately how long has it been around. So it's, as I said, this is a very gentle technique that one can practice with themselves to create more awareness about what is actually happening and how your mind is actually working. And then it's like anything. From one thing that seemed clunky at the start, it just happens. You get to the point where you might walk into a room and there's like an insecurity, an insecure thought comes in. And then you say, oh, just change it. Yeah, that's it. Turn it around, carry on with your day. Because you realize there's no weight behind it. You've taken the power away from it. And when you begin to write these down, as I said, you really see the weight and power that these particular words carry. And that's what a lot of the work is too, is like something can be so powerful enough to actually change the course of your life. Some words can be that powerful. Like, you're not good enough. You know? You don't belong here. These words can be incredibly heavy for people and so change their whole life. So you've got to start somewhere. And the way that it starts is by you actually being the one to change it. Because we can't rely on people forever. And you can't rely on your partners like that. You can't be like, every time you're insecure, oh, tell me what I need to hear. Tell me what I need to hear. That's just seeking validation. That's seeking approval. That's playing into old patterns. So you don't need, that's not sustainable. And it's probably, for a lot of people listening, in hindsight, like what broke down a lot of relationships.
Thank you for sharing that. It's beautiful. Is there anything else you would like to share on that topic?
I would say that when one actually chooses to put themselves first, the results are not only phenomenal, but they're also incredibly complementary. Because when one has learned the lessons that need to be learned, particularly in relationships, you naturally attract a relationship you deserve and one that you are worthy of. And I believe that everybody is worthy of a good relationship. But the most important thing is you have to believe that you are worthy of that. Otherwise, it will never come. And the most valuable thing that you can bring to a relationship, the most valuable asset, is accountability through the intention and the knowing of self-reflection, of going in. If you bring that to a relationship, both people bring that into a relationship, you are starting from safety. You're starting from a place of security. It means that you're a human being, stuff's going to come up. But it means when it does, you put your hand up and say, oh, that's mine. Yeah. Okay, where did that come from? Okay. And you can actually talk about it. You're not projecting it. You're sitting with it. You can invite your partner in because they know that it's not their fault. It's not about them. And so they can actually hold you. They can support you very organically. And when both people are doing that, it's a very gentle space. And it took me a long time to work out, even though friends had told me, that relationships are meant to be easy. The easy parts are meant to be easy, And of course, life's life, right? Anybody who thinks that life isn't meant to be challenging or have challenges is probably going to have a hard time in life. So it's the fundamentals. The fundamentals are meant to be easy. And you shouldn't have to think too hard about them. And when you've got the fundamentals down and it feels very natural, then it's a very good sign.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think it's a good note to end on. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hariom.
Hariom.
Good. Right in time, because I saw the energy saver being turned on. I was like, ooh,